Welcome to another Pirkei Avot shir. We are going to do chapter 6, Mishna 4, and we dedicate this Mishna in memory of Levy ben Moshe Esther and Elishavayel ben Levy, and also in memory of Rosie bat Moshe Esther. And here is Micah.
Thank you, Rav Mashiach. So in this Mishnah, we are going to learn about the different ways that one should study Torah. I'm not sure who the author is.
Doesn't say it here.
But let's start anyway. So it says, Kach hi darcha shel Torah. Such is the way of Torah study. Pas b'melech ta'ochal. Eat a piece of bread with salt. Or mayim b'msura tishteh. And drink water in a rationed measure. Val ha'oretz tishan, and sleep on the ground. V'chayai tza'a techya, and live a life of hardship. Uvatorah ata amal, and in the Torah do you toil. Im ata oseh ken ashrecha v'tov lach. If you do so, and I quote, happy shall you be, and it shall be well with you. Ashrecha ba'olam hazeh v'tov lach le'olam haba. Happy shall you be in this world, and it shall be well with you in the world to come. So in this Mishnah, it seems like it's the author is alluding to promoting the values of asceticism, which is kind of denying yourself or living in a very parched way, so to speak. An example of someone who used to live ascetically is a Nazir, and we will just talk about a Nazir for a second. We know that someone who takes a vow to be a Nazir, as it's quoted, to be separated and consecrated to Hashem. In this period of being a Nazir, he cannot drink wine, cut his hair, or become ritually defiled by a dead body. And should this period of being a Nazir break off suddenly because the Nazir accidentally became ritually defiled, and he must bring sacrifices to the temple as a sin offering. And I quote, and the Kohen shall make atonement for him because he sinned towards the soul. So asks Rav Elazar HaKapar, what was his sin? That he should require atonement. It was that he deprived himself of wine. So from here we know, even if undefiled, a Nazir would be considered guilty, as Rashi points out, that every Nazir must equally bring a sin offering when his period of consecration ends. Now, surely it's a kal v'chomer. That's a kal v'chomer. If a person who inflicted no other suffering on himself but abstention from wine is called a sinner, how much more so would one who deprives himself of anything it be called a sinner? So therefore the Talmud concludes, whoever needlessly maintains a fast is considered a sinner. I think we see this in Gemara Nedarim, Daf 10 Omid Aleph. So Judaism clearly does not urge Jewish people to flee a life of ordinary pleasures, claiming that they are sinful. In the words of the Kuzari, and I quote, the divine Torah imposes on us not asceticism, but that we follow a balanced middle path, granting every mental and physical faculty its just portion, without excess. For if one faculty is overindulged, another is deprived of its due. If someone gives way freely to desires, he blunts his thinking ability, nor is prolonged fasting a mode of pious worship for a weak, thin person whose desires are not strong. It's better for him to gratify his body's need for food. Nor is the diminution of wealth a way towards piety. If a person obtains his wealth in a permissible way without tremendous toil, so that its acquisition does not interfere with his study and good deeds, especially as is true for one who has children to rear, and if he can expend part of it in charity, it's even more so. Your religiosity on a fast day comes no closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu than your joy on the Shabbos and festival days. If your joy is the expression of a holy, devout heart, and if your happiness overflows into melody and dance, that too is worship and communion with divinity. Those are the words of the Kuzari. So our religion tries to understand what it is for a human to suffer, and teaches the Jew to perhaps live with it, but it certainly does not seek pain and deprivation as a religious virtue. We know that asceticism has only has a place in a balanced life under the Torah, as we learn with the Rambam. He teaches us in Shemona Prakim, in Guide to the Perplexed, and also in Hilchot Deot, chapter 3, that a person who has debased himself in a life of excess, who has enjoyed too much luxury, gluttony, and various other things, for him, a swing to the other extreme for a period may be the only psychological and physical cure. But given half a chance, our sort of base desires can grow overwhelmingly strong with the kind of primal, undisciplined energies of the libido. Then only a radical counter-movement or a program of asceticism can restore a sane balance to the human psyche. But it's always in extreme cases. You have to go the other way, as Rambam taught, to counterbalance. But always the best path is the middle path. But let's look. I want to comment on these few analogies that the author has used. He mentions, such as the way of the Torah study, to eat a piece of bread with salt. To me, that means, it doesn't mean the literal meaning of you must restrict your diet to bread and salt. I think bread is an analogy or is an allusion to Torah, and salt is an analogy to commentary or explanation. So the bread is the Torah Bichtav, and the salt is the Torah Lishma. Shebal Peh. You can't have commentary without the Torah, like salt without bread is inedible. But if you add commentary to Torah, if you add salt to bread, you find that the natural flavors come out. Like it magnifies or it reveals flavors within the bread that normally you would not have without the salt. And he tells us also to drink water in a rationed measure. We know that Torah has always been compared to water in various sources. In fact, I think we mentioned them in the first perek of Pirkei Avot. But this is interesting. He says, drink water in rationed measure. Now, I know that if you want to make a serious career of studying Torah, you have to pace yourself. And Rambam and other people always urge us to do a little every day. Rambam tells us when you're going to give charity, if you have £100,000 to give to charity, don't give it in one go. Give £1,000 100 times is better, because it becomes ingrained in your psyche. The repeated acts tend to have a far more permanent effect on our psyche. So when you are confronted by the voluminous texts that we have to study as Jews of our Torah, you must not take on too many big chunks in one go, because you can end up exhausted and it may make you feel like you can't take it anymore after a while. You become too tired. You learn a little bit by little bit every day. Learn a few Mishnahs. Set yourself a program of easily completed tasks, and you'll find that you will cover a lot, because you'll always be energized. I'm going to bring us a proof to this, or an analogy to this. Rav Yochanan taught, consider a huge mound of earth. What does a fool say to it? And I quote, who can shovel that down? What does a bright man say? Let me shovel off 2 basketfuls today and 2 tomorrow and the same after tomorrow and so on until I shovel it all away. And what does a fool say? Who can ever learn the entire Torah? This section has 30 chapters. That part has another 30 chapters, etc. The wise man says, let me learn 2 topics today, 2 tomorrow, and so on until I have learnt it all. So that was Rav Yochanan, who was that comes from Midrash Rabbah on Shir HaShirim. And then the last suggestion that the author makes in our Mishnah, it says to sleep on the ground. Now, we also learned in the first perek of Pirkei Avot about how in the olden days, or in the times of the Mishnah, the students used to sit on the floor and the teachers used to stand and teach them. And this perhaps is a allusion to sleeping on the ground. In other words, study so consistently and so regularly that perhaps you fall asleep in your place of study after perhaps an exhausting session of debate. When you sleep on the ground, it tends to connote a place of study. In other words, if you fall asleep in your place of study after, the toil that we are supposed to do, the Mishnah says, and in the Torah do you toil. It tells you, exert yourself. If you end up falling asleep at the end of a session, there's no shame in that. So that's my interpretation of those various analogies that the author brings. But let's look at some other.
After you.
Let's look at some other analogies or stories regarding. The Midrash tells us of a time that King Solomon was deposed from his throne by Ashmedai, who was the king of demons, and he had to wander as a beggar seeking alms. Once a man recognized him, and eagerly he took King Solomon to his home. He slaughtered an ox in honor of him and served the king a royal feast. But throughout, to taunt him spitefully, he kept on about the glory that had once been King Solomon's. So unable to bear such memories, King Solomon started to weep throughout the entire meal. The next day, a poor man recognized King Solomon and offered to share his bitter vegetables with the monarch. During the meager ghost of a meal, the man sought to comfort King Solomon by showing him all that the Almighty would certainly return him to the throne, and King Solomon found his food most satisfying. When he did regain his throne, he eventually wrote, and I quote, "Better is a dinner of herbs where affection is than a fatted ox where hatred is." This was in his Proverbs 15:17. Let's also look at the commentary Ruach Chaim, who notes, Rav Chaim of Volodyin, who notes something very interesting. If you translate our text, where it says, "A piece of bread with salt shall you eat, water in rationed measure shall you drink," etc. And in the Torah, "do you toil." All the verbs are in the future tense, except the last one about the Torah, "do you toil." It's in the present. Eating, drinking, sleeping are matters which can be put off to the future, relegated to a secondary role as relatively unimportant. Studying Torah, however, is of immediate concern. It must be done in the present, now, not delayed or postponed. Through Torah study is the world preserved and maintained. It is a vehicle for moral education and progress in the world. Just to finish off with a story, a good example of how you should act in this world with acquiring your so-called knowledge of Torah and studying the Torah. A tale is told of two people sent to a country fair to buy merchandise. One, a wise man, spent the first 3 days on business, selecting carefully from the wares on display, bargaining shrewdly and making his purchases. Finding he had time left, he visited the town, explored the countryside, and thoroughly enjoyed himself before he returned home. The other, a foolish man, spent the first 3 days seeing the sights and doing the town. Only on the fourth day did he set out on his task. But by then the best goods in the market were gone, and only some spoiled and discarded, rejected wares were left. So sad and forlorn, he returned with nothing. So the lesson is, each of us finds the same alternatives in life. We can act either as the wise man or the fool, and the way of the Torah is to first acquire its priceless knowledge. So yeah, that's please.
I heard another take on this Mishnah from Rabbi Zev Leff. He gives a very interesting pshat. He says, if you think about it, the Mishnah says, this is the way of the Torah: eat bread with salt, drink water in small measure, sleep on the ground, live a life of deprivation. What is that? Whoever did that? I mean, nobody does that now. Rabbi Leff brings an example. He says the only thing he can think to compare this to, he says he had an old aunt who lived somewhere in America who used to sleep on the ground because she had a bad back. He said other than that, he knew nobody who slept on the ground. He said this is the 21st century. Nobody does this. So he says, he gives a different explanation. He says, it's not that you have to eat bread with salt, drink water in small measure, and sleep on the ground, and live a life of deprivation. He says those are the things, not that you have to do, but that you should be prepared to do. Because look at the end of those things. It says, but toil in the Torah. He says, whether you've got a big house, a mansion, 5 BMWs, you go on holidays 18 times a year, learn Torah. Very good. It's easy for you. You have maybe you might not be a stressful businessman. Maybe you do have time. You have to learn Torah. Those that life of riches presents its own challenges. But what happens if you're poor? All you can afford is bread and a bit of salt, bit of water in small measure, and you've got no bed. Use that as an excuse not to learn Torah. No, it says. It implies, rather, Pirkei, even though that's all you have, it says, but toil in the Torah. Don't use it as an excuse. Be prepared to learn Torah under all and every circumstance, whether it's a life of deprivation that is cast upon you, because that's your lot in life, or by extension, I'm adding this on off my own back, or by extension, you're so rich, and you're a businessman who happens to be shackled to his business, and you've got no time. It says it doesn't matter. Well, first and primarily, the Mishna is talking about somebody who's so poor, and maybe he's trying to eke out a living. You're not patur from Torah, even if you're eking out a living. You still have to learn Torah. Okay, maybe you might not learn 20 hours a day because you have to go out and feed your family, but be prepared. The message here, says Rabbi Leff, is be prepared to toil in the Torah under all and every circumstance that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends your way.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Thank you so much, Michael. That was a very, very interesting take on the Mishnah. Especially, I really enjoyed your own pshat there. I think anyone who wants to repeat this, maybe say it in Michael's name so you can get a zechut for this, because I really enjoyed it. We discussed it even before we started recording. So with that, we're going to, next time we convene, we will, Bezrat Hashem, do the 5th Mishnah about don't seek greatness for yourself and don't crave honor. That's another key to humility. Okay? Until then, we wish you a wonderful and blessed week.